dear students, and welcome. Be here with you today, and without further ado, let us discuss what is critical thinking. We often hear people speaking about critical thinking, teaching critical thinking, having critical thinking skills. But in the great tradition initiated by Plato, we must ask ourselves two important questions. First, of course, what is critical thinking? And can critical thinking be taught? These are basic questions that you can find in almost all of its dialogues. And they structured the way we think about subjects in general, objects of knowledge, and the way we teach in general any subject. Common definition or intuition about critical thinking consider it to be the ability one has to question, to analyze, to challenge information, values, common sense ideas, and especially the information we are exposed to on social media. This intuition is accompanied with a very tempting assumption that the individual proves to be independent, proves to be smart and slick, if he or she is able to stand up to society and to challenge the claims are being presented as universal truth. Critical thinking is thus the trait of an accomplished individual who stands out and does not follow the herd. We often think very poorly about those who tend to have that what we call herd mentality and just obey to the rules because others are doing it. We see that we tend to associate critical thinking with moral traits. The individual who exercises critical thinking is independent, courageous, and able to so-called think for himself. Critical thinking makes sense in a society that places a great deal of importance on the individual and their ability to stand out. One might ask themselves, can the society, can a collective of people express and can they have also critical thinking as a collective? There is a thing you might ask ourselves, because usually critical thinking is a trait of the individual, isn't it? And it is conceived to be in opposition with society. The individual having critical thinking skills usually challenges the truth that society in general expose as universal truth. Now, part of the reason why critical thinking became a brand, especially in the liberal democracies who cherish individual freedom, is the fact that how can you exercise your individual freedom if you don't have independent thinking? So in our liberal societies that cherish individual freedom and the right to self-determination, critical thinking is a fundamental skill that one has to possess in order to be a valuable member of that society. But if we move away from this brand of critical thinking, from the intuition and from the way critical thinking is presented in our society, we have to analyze the term as it stands and see what it means. Maybe critical thinking is something that expresses the same thing with two words. Tautology, meaning that we say the same thing twice using the same words. So let us ask ourselves, it is possible to have thinking, but to not have critical thinking. Is critical thinking a subspecies of thinking in general? Well, the definition of thinking, as you learned, and especially the Romanian students have learned it during the course in psychology in the 11th grade, puts a great deal of emphasis on the operations of thinking, on the cognitive process of comparing, analyzing, synthesizing, or making analogies. Now, if this is thinking, what does critical means? It means exercising of evolved or careful judgment or judicious evaluation. So what we would say that critical thinking is especially this ability of using our reason to challenge, to analyze, to judge what is being presented to us as the truth. So here you see that the element critical is fundamental, because exercising thinking in general does not mean exercising critical thinking. How come, you may ask yourselves? Well, there is a saying that we as humans are rational beings, but recently psychologists came up with a different understanding of that, saying that we are rationalizing beings. What could that mean? Well, it means that we find reasons, we find ourselves probably in difficult situations, and we use our thinking to justify, to legitimize a situation, even a situation of abuse where we are the abusers. Just think of those people who worked in the gas chambers, and they found reasons to justify what they did. So they use thinking to justify what was being presented by the Nazi society, by the Nazi system, as the truth. So they use the reasons and the thinking skills to justify a situation, not to challenge it. And this is why it is important to understand that critical thinking means using your thinking abilities to challenge what is being presented as the truth. And you may think to yourself, well, in our society where we are used to challenge everything, we are used to criticize politicians and to challenge them, to challenge our professors, to challenge everything. Are there any truths that are almost never challenged? Well, I'll let you think about this while presenting some of the so-called truth that are not very often challenged in our society, and they go like this. We must accept the free market as the best tool for allocating resources. The free market economy, for some economists, is considered to be almost a fundamental truth never to be challenged. We must accept social inequality as inevitable. Some people say that inequality in our society is almost natural, and it mimics what's happening in real world, in nature. So if we don't have equality in nature, therefore in our society, we can't expect to have equality or equity. Another question. Poverty can never be alleviated. Poverty is thought to be a social ill that will never disappear. Prostitution will never die. You hear people often say that it's somehow one of the oldest so-called form of work in the world, so you can never expect this to go away, another social ill that we can't expect to go away. As poverty will never go away, well, we will always have people desperate enough to resort to this form of earning money, isn't it? Or that pornography could never be abolished, since there is such a high demand. It is unrealistic for us to expect that this type of social ill will ever disappear. Now, another important claim that is not often challenged. Democratic liberalism is the best possible political system. We often see its limits, but this claim is not very often challenged. Or capitalism is the best guarantee for democracy. There are people who think that it is simply impossible to have democracy and not have capitalism as the economic system guaranteeing it. Socialism will inevitably lead to authoritarianism, another claim that is not challenged and is taken for granted that any kind of socialist organization of society will inevitably lead to authoritarianism. These are considered common sense truth in our society. These are the kinds of truth that people are likely to never question. So probably there is a lot of work to be done for those who really want to exercise critical thinking. I gave you just a few examples, and I'm pretty sure you can find many others. But as we shall see, and when we will discuss in a more detailed manner the term critical thinking, the use of critical thinking, or to base our definition of thinking, does not allow us to progress, because once we define it is a common mistake usually when we give definitions to just define in inverted comma the term using some sort of a synonym of part of that, saying that poetry is poetic writing. So we just place the burden and the task of defining poetry on poetic writing, which is pretty much the same thing. So probably critical thinking means that we use our ability of thinking and thinking by its laws in order to challenge some of the basic truths that are not often challenged in our society. And what is very important here is that we don't simply think, but we think by obeying some rules, very important principles and reasoning rules. Simply uttering word is just engaging in delirious verbiage, is not thinking. And it is vital to know, isn't it? What are the basic laws that should guide our thinking, our reasoning process? The question was first answered in a systematic manner by the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle. This law of thinking came to be known as the subject of logic, and Aristotle was the founder of this discipline. Now, the Romanian students that probably studied logic in their 9th grade will probably frown at this particular moment, since critical thinking is such might be interesting. Critical thinking has all this branding effort attached to it, saying that those who have critical thinking are independent, are brave, are courageous, do not have the herd mentality. But when a Romanian student hears logic, he or she might instantaneously think of that what they studied in the 9th grade, and the image probably is not there that appealing. So probably the first task that we should take here is to use our critical thinking skills to challenge a common sense claim that goes like this: logic is a boring subject, isn't it? So it is possible probably to use critical thinking skills to challenge this common sense claim. Because probably we should be able to place some of the glamour, or to transfer some of the glamour that we packaging the term critical thinking, and to transfer that to the less branded, less cool, less interesting by our intuition and our common sense term logic. Because logic and critical thinking are pretty much the same thing. Logic offers us the basic rules to exercise critical thinking. Without logic, one cannot really say they possess critical thinking skills. Now, coming back to the second question, very important one. So in the great tradition initiated by Plato, it is not enough to see what critical thinking is. A question that almost obsessively preoccupies the characters of Plato, Socrates, that is, he is the one constantly asking questions in his dialogue, and he constantly asks, can the good or the science of the good morals be taught? We must ask ourselves, can critical thinking be taught? Because if it can be taught, then why are we even aiming to study the critical thinking here? I should say that this one has not a definitive answer. What do I mean by that? Well, we might study the laws of thinking, but then do not underestimate the power of irrationality. Only knowing the laws of logic is a necessary but not enough condition to be rational and to exercise critical thinking. What do I mean by that? Well, consider the following dialogue. Dear Susie, you've done so well in your critical thinking test. How did you do it? Well, it was actually easy. I studied a lot, but the crucial thing was that I was wearing my lucky red socks on the day of the exam. So the lucky red socks made me got an A to that exam in logic and critical thinking. By this example, you can easily see that there are limits to our course. We can learn the laws of reasoning. We can go back to Aristotle even for the learning of syllogism and the way to build arguments and valid arguments and to draw true conclusions, starting, of course, with true premises. But we can never completely erase irrationality. And I'm telling you this not to say that what we do here is not important, but I'm telling you this because I would not like you to place on logic and this course magical powers. This course has to be, and I have to be honest with you, teaches you the logical laws of thinking. Exercising critical thinking implies also good management of emotions, probably, and it implies knowledge, a lot of knowledge that you may acquire from other courses that you teach in this department. Logic gives you the structure, but in order to have a beautiful building and a well-accomplished building, you have to have also the necessary materials that you put on that structure, isn't it? So keep in mind this metaphor and do not hope to be magically initiated into into becoming a perfectly rational being just by studying this course. Studying is very important, is necessary, but is not enough. Now, putting too much emphasis on logic, I would say, is illogical. What do I mean? We might witness situations, unfortunately, where logic is fetishized. That is, magical powers are associating with its mastering. And of course, nothing can be more irrational. In the wave of 2016 elections, when President Trump came to power, the academia, the intellectuals in general, and the liberal elites were horrified by the public's willingness to believe the most illogical sentences, falsehoods, and that were being uttered unhinged in the public sphere. The pandemic and the wild conspiracy theories only amplified that fear. The solution was to put more critical thinking classes in the curriculum. At the first glance, that might seem commendable, but there is an irrational belief at work here. The liberal elites thought that logic is a magic power that the public may use when confronted with ludicrous claim about the chips in the vaccines and the remote mind control exercise through 5G devices. Logic, in their opinion, would be some sort of sword, some sort of magic tool, magic wand that the citizens would use to cut through these exotic claims. Well, unfortunately, these elites lacked a very important information that we will develop and study in detail in this course, and that is the relation between truth and validity. What do I mean by that? Well, we may have perfectly valid arguments obeying the law described by logic, and yet, due to the fact that those arguments are based on false premises, the conclusions are also false. Take the following example. All representatives of authorities lie. Raed Arafat is a representative of the authorities. Therefore, Raed Arafat lies. We heard time and again this argument. And let me tell you that this is a perfectly valid syllogism from a formal point of view. This is logically sound. This is logically correct. The problem is that we started off with a very questionable, with a false premise, and that is a generalization. All authorities lie. So we correctly inferred from that if Raed Arafat is the representative of authority, then therefore he lies. So formally, the argument is valid, but the conclusion is still false. And we shall come back to this because this is very important. Bear in mind that you have to have two conditions in order to reach true premises. You have to start off with true premises, and you have to have a logically valid argument. And where does this course come in? This course teaches you how to form logically valid arguments. About the truth of the premises, you have to study other disciplines in order to make sure that you use what you learn here, that is, to form valid arguments, in order to reach true conclusions, to determine the truth of the premises, then use what you learn here, that is, to form valid arguments, and that way you will make sure that you will reach true conclusions. Because otherwise, you may indulge yourself and you may think that if you know very well the laws of the syllogism, or if you know very well first order logic, and you know very well how to distinguish and how to determine what the fallacies are, you might be, how should I say, fake news proofed, in a sense that you will have the magic wand to protect you from falsehoods. And unfortunately, this is not the case. As I told you, logic by itself offers you the structure. What you put on that structure is equally important if you want to reach true conclusions. So validity and truth are two different things. The truth of the conclusion and the validity of the argument are two different things. because it is equally important to start off the starting point. If you start with false premises, then you may end up very well with false conclusion, as in the example that I just showed you. So also another way of fetishizing the logic is thinking that perfectly rational beings, perfectly rational subjects that rely their whole life on logic, and they use their critical thinking skills in all aspects of their life, are those who manage their emotions very well, or even those who lack emotions. The ideal of perfect rationality almost always there are centuries in this philosophical tradition, and this assumption is yet to be challenged by our critical thinking students, who are the students who learn critical thinking, is that you may never reach the ideal of perfect rationality if you have emotions. Emotions and reason are in two mutually exclusive classes. Okay, so those who are emotional can never be rational. And this infantile representation of logic as the robotic self-control individual was present in the famous TV series Star Trek. The famous Vulcanians and characters like Mr. Spock or T'Pol are the embodiment of beings taking logic as their religion and believing in it like some sort of members of a cult that believe in a spiritual being. Of course, they tend to do that by completely ignoring the limits of logic, its ability to produce on its own empirical knowledge. That's what I just told you, that logic offers the structure, it does not offer information on the truth of the premises. And also, they completely ignore the fact that, for example, in first order logic, processes are very difficult to formalize and to express into a formal language, that it is very difficult to put in a formula even a simple sentence like "my dog barks." And for those of you who are interested, I will develop this and I will give an answer to why these things happen, and why is it difficult in first order logic to have a formula, to have the formal expression using the language of logic for this very simple sentence. So logic has its limitations, many of them being ignored by the characters on Vulcan, who apparently live on this planet where emotions are very well managed. So we live in a world of representations that are very often shaped by very naive media narratives. This is why I brought this example into consideration, because I think it does more harm than good in terms of how we think about logic in general and our popular culture. And to tell you that the idea is that we have to first challenge the simple claim that logic is a boring subject. I will do my best to tell you and to show you that it is not boring at all. And also, we have to understand that learning logic is the necessary but not sufficient condition to get closer to the ideal of rationality. As for the very naive representation of logic as the characteristic of human beings or of beings in general that lack emotions, we will have a further discussion, and we will discuss it also during our seminar. This is an open question. Why do you think that in our Western culture we think about rationality as opposed to emotions? And is it possible to have a drive, to have even the desire to learn critical thinking if we don't have emotions? Is it possible to have thinking at all without having emotions? Why is it that we tend to think of the two as so separate? And also, why do we tend to believe that usually men possess critical thinking and reason, while women are more prone to emotions and intuitions? So this question is open. This question is open for debate, and I'm very curious to learn what you think. This is it for the short introduction for today, and we will start the next course by discussing the logical principles. Thank you, and I hope that proved to be useful.